Welcome back, everybody. So glad to have you with us again. And hey, if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Keep those questions coming because, we love digging into them. And this one is a doozy. We had someone reach out wanting to know, why in the world did it take Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie a whole 8 years to finalize their divorce? What's the deal with that? Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? You think about celebrity divorces, you kind of expect these quick splits, settlements wrapped up in a flash. But this one kind of throws that whole idea out the window. They were only married, 2 years? But legally, it took 4 times as long to untangle their lives. It's kind of mind-blowing when you put it like that, right? 2 years to get hitched, 8 to get unhitched. So where do we even begin to unpack this whole timeline? What makes this divorce different from, say, your typical Hollywood split? Well, the sources you sent over point to a few things. Celebrity divorces, even under normal circumstances, they can be pretty complex, right? You've got major assets to figure out who gets what. Often you've got businesses together, and of course the public eye is always there watching every move. But this case seems to have something more. The sources hint at this animosity that goes beyond just your typical irreconcilable differences. One quote that really jumped out at me was this idea of a desire to harm the other. That suggests something a lot deeper and a lot more contentious is driving this whole legal battle. It definitely makes it sound a lot more bitter than your average split. And I could see how that kind of bad blood could drag the whole thing out. But is that the whole story? Is there anything else that could explain this 8-year saga? Well, the sources highlight this one legal detail that I thought was really interesting. One of the articles actually quotes a lawyer who specializes in these high-profile divorces, and he says that even with really complicated assets, these cases are usually settled much faster. So that 8-year timeline really suggests there's something else going on here. Yeah, that makes sense. It can't just be a messy breakup. Did the sources give any clues about what specifically might be causing these holdups? Actually, yeah, they did. One big thing that kept coming up was their French vineyard, Château Miraval. And this wasn't just a business investment for them. They actually got married at the property. Wow. So you can just imagine the emotional baggage that comes with that. It's not just splitting up a business, it's dividing a place full of memories and personal significance. I bet that adds a whole other level of complexity to these negotiations. So absolutely. And it gets even more complicated because according to the sources, Jolie sold her part of the vineyard to a company owned by a Russian oligarch. And Pitt is now fighting that sale in court. He says they had an agreement not to sell their shares without each other's consent. So we've got this complicated asset already loaded with emotional baggage. And then you add in these potentially conflicting business agreements. That sounds like a recipe for a legal standoff, wouldn't you say? It definitely does. And remember, this is just one piece of the puzzle. We haven't even touched on the custody battle involving their 6 children. That adds another layer of complexity on top of everything else. You're right, the kids are a huge part of this story. Yeah. One of the sources mentioned that one of their children, Shiloh, actually petitioned to remove Pitt from her name. That says a lot about the family dynamics at play here. Imagine going through a separation with that level of family drama, and then you add in the constant media scrutiny. It's a lot. It makes you realize this isn't just a legal battle. It's a family going through this really difficult and very public separation. And that public eye, it adds a whole other level of pressure, wouldn't you say? Totally. It's hard enough to deal with a divorce privately, let alone having every single detail of your life picked apart by the media. I can't even imagine. Makes you wonder how much that public scrutiny affects how these divorces actually play out. Do you think maybe the media attention influences the legal strategies or even, personal decisions during the process? That's a great question. It makes you think about the whole idea of celebrity relationships and how much we as the public really understand about what's going on behind closed doors. But before we go down that rabbit hole, I think it's important to remember the human element of all of this. This isn't just some celebrity drama playing out in the tabloids. This is a real family going through something really painful. Yeah, I totally agree. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines and all the legal back and forth, but we can't forget that there are real people and real emotions at the heart of this. And speaking of real people, let's bring it back to our listener who was specifically interested in the length of this divorce. We've touched on some of the things that might be contributing to that extended timeline, but what can we definitively say about why it's taken so long? Well, I can't say for sure without knowing all the legal ins and outs, but it seems pretty clear that the combination of these complex assets, a really contentious custody battle, and this significant level of animosity between them has created this perfect storm for a really, really long divorce process. And like we mentioned earlier, the public eye and all the media attention surrounding the case probably doesn't help. Oh, definitely not. It's hard to imagine that level of scrutiny not having some kind of impact on the way this whole thing is played out. So for our listener, it seems like the answer to their question is this kind of perfect storm of different factors, the complexities that come with any high-profile divorce. And then you add in this really contentious relationship, a difficult custody battle, and the constant pressure of the public eye. Would you say that's a fair assessment? Yeah, I think that sums it up really well. And it brings up a really important point. The details of this case are fascinating, but it's important to remember that the Jolie-Pitt divorce, this isn't really a typical divorce experience. That's a great point. It's easy to get wrapped up in the celebrity of it all and forget that this is a very specific and very unique situation. Exactly. And it's really important to make that distinction clear for our listener, especially if they're maybe looking for insights that might be relevant to their own lives. I think that's a perfect place to pause. We've laid the groundwork, explored some of the big factors driving this long divorce, and reminded ourselves that this is a very unique situation. When we come back, I'd love to dig a little deeper into the custody battle and how the kids have been affected by this very public separation. It's interesting to think about that custody battle in the context of, those harm the other sentiments we talked about earlier. Custody disputes, they can get so messy, especially when you have those underlying tensions and maybe one parent wanting to, exert more control. Yeah, that's a good point. It's one thing to divide up, property and money. But when kids are involved, the stakes are just so much higher. The sources mentioned that Pitt was initially denied joint custody, but then later a court did grant him joint custody. That had to be a huge point of contention between them. Oh, for sure. And, even that wasn't the end of it. The private judge who was overseeing the case, he was eventually removed because he didn't disclose some previous business relationships with Pitt's lawyers. Wait. So does that mean the custody battle could basically start all over again? It's definitely possible. Removing the judge, it raises questions about, the validity of that earlier custody ruling, and it could open the door for a whole new round of legal proceedings. So you've got this ongoing legal battle over assets, and then on top of that, the custody arrangements are potentially up in the air. It's no wonder this divorce has dragged on for so long. And for their kids, that means years of uncertainty and instability. It's hard to imagine what kind of impact this is having on them. Absolutely. One of the sources, an article in People magazine, they quoted a child psychologist who specializes in these high-profile divorces. And she said that for kids in these situations, the constant media attention and the back and forth of legal proceedings can be incredibly traumatic. Yeah, I can only imagine. It's hard enough for kids to deal with their parents splitting up, but then you add in the public scrutiny and these drawn-out legal battles. It must feel like their lives are constantly in limbo. And remember, we're talking about 6 children here, each with their own individual needs and experiences. That's a really good point. The sources don't really go into detail about each child's specific experience, but it's important to remember that they're not, all going through this the same way. Each child is going to process this differently and cope with these challenges in their own way. And, we can't forget about Shiloh's petition to remove Pitt's name. That suggests a level of emotional distress that's hard to even fathom. It makes you think about the long-term implications of this kind of high-conflict divorce, for the children involved. It really does. And it underscores how important it is to put the children's well-being first throughout the entire process. One of the articles mentioned that both Pitt and Jolie have said publicly that they're committed to protecting their kids from, the media frenzy. But it's hard to imagine how you can truly shield them from the fallout of such a public and contentious separation. It's like a no-win situation, isn't it? Yet, on the one hand, you want to protect your kids from the public eye, but then on the other hand, the legal battle itself is playing out on this very public stage. Exactly. It's such a tricky balance to strike, and it's impossible to say for sure what the right way to handle this is. Every family is different, and what works for one might not work for another. So for our listener who was really interested in why this divorce has taken so long, it seems like the custody battle is a big part of that puzzle. The ongoing legal disputes the possibility of, new proceedings and the emotional toll on the kids. All of that contributes to this extended timeline. I think that's a really fair assessment. And it reminds us that while, the public might be focused on the division of assets and the celebrity drama, the real heart of this story is in the impact on the family, especially the kids. As we've been talking about this case, I keep thinking about how much our perception of celebrity relationships is shaped by the media. We see the glamorous photo shoots, the red carpet appearances, the carefully curated, social media posts, but we rarely get a glimpse into what their lives are really like behind closed doors. Right. It's easy to forget that celebrities are real people with real emotions and real challenges, just like everyone else. And in this case, we're seeing a very public and very messy breakdown of a relationship that was once, portrayed as this fairy tale romance. It makes you question all the stories we tell ourselves about these relationships and how much we can really know about what's going on beneath the surface. For sure. And it begs the question, how much does that public eye influence not only our perception of these relationships, but the way they actually unfold? Do celebrities feel this pressure to keep up a certain image even when things are falling apart in their personal lives? Those are such good questions, and ones that we might not have any clear answers to, but they're definitely worth thinking about as we try to make sense of this very public and very complex divorce. Yeah, I agree. And maybe it's a good reminder to be a little more aware of the stories we're consuming about celebrity relationships and to remember that there's always more to the story than what we see on the surface. I think that's a really valuable takeaway. It's a reminder to be a little more critical of the stories we're told and to be a little more empathetic to the real people behind those headlines, regardless of their fame or fortune. Well said. So as we wrap up this part of our conversation, is there anything else that stood out to you from the sources? Anything that you found particularly surprising or thought-provoking? One thing that really struck me was how much the experts emphasized separating this case from a typical divorce. They kept saying, don't use the Jolie-Pitt divorce as a model for other couples going through a separation. Yeah, that's right. They were very clear that this is an outlier, both in how long it's taken and the amount of public attention it's gotten. Exactly. And I think that's a really important message for our listener, especially if they're going through divorce themselves. It's easy to get caught up in the drama of a high-profile case like this, but it's so important to remember that every divorce is unique. And what works for one couple might not work for another. Couldn't agree more. It's crucial to get advice and support from professionals who really understand divorce law and can give you advice tailored to your specific situation. So for our listener, the key takeaway here is to avoid comparing their own experience to, these highly publicized and often sensationalized accounts of celebrity divorces. Instead, they should focus on their own individual needs and find resources and support that are relevant to their own situation. I think that's a great summary. And it reminds us that while celebrity divorces, they can be fascinating to follow, they don't necessarily offer, practical advice or guidance for the average person going through a separation. Well, I think we've covered a lot in this conversation, but there's one last piece of this case I think is worth exploring, and that's the financial implications of such a long and drawn-out divorce. When we come back, let's dive into the legal fees, division of assets, and the long-term financial impact of this 8-year battle. So we talked about the emotional side of things and the impact on the kids, but let's be honest, a divorce like this, that's got to come with a hefty price tag. What about the financial side of this 8-year saga? Oh yeah, you're absolutely right. This isn't just heartbreak. We're talking serious money here. One of the sources, a Forbes article, they actually crunched some numbers, estimated the costs, and it's pretty eye-watering. They're saying the legal fees alone could easily be millions of dollars for each side. Millions. Wow, that's more than most people make in their lifetime. I mean, it's hard to imagine the kind of money you need to keep a legal battle like this going for 8 years. It really shows you the difference between these celebrity divorces and what the average person goes through, right? Most people just don't have that kind of cash to throw around. And it's not just the lawyers, right? I mean, there's experts, forensic accountants, custody evaluators, all that adds up. Oh yeah, for sure. And then there's the actual splitting up of their assets. We talked about the vineyard, but they've also got a huge art collection, real estate all over the world, shares in different businesses. Untangling all that takes time, and time in the legal world means money. So for our listener who was asking about why this divorce took so long, the financial side of things, it seems like a big piece of the puzzle. Their finances are super complicated, and then you add in the fact that they're willing to spend a ton of money on lawyers. It's no wonder they could drag this out for so much longer than most couples. Exactly. It really shows you how money can kind of buy you more time in the legal system. But it makes you wonder, though, is it really a win when you're spending years and potentially millions of dollars just fighting in court? What's the cost, even if you can afford it? That's a great point. One of the sources, a Vanity Fair article, talked to a divorce mediator who works with a lot of high net worth people